Hello there, Mr. Wilson here again for another episode of How Do I Help My Child With? And in this episode, we're going to have a look at multiplying and dividing by 10, 100, and 1000. Now, the key words in this topic are place value and the decimal point. So, we're going to have a look at multiplying first, and then we're going to look at dividing. Now, just before we get started, it is really easy for students to kind of find a pattern and then stick with it. Even though that pattern might only work for a small amount of cases and it doesn't actually work for the whole system. What I'm trying to get at here is when you say to some students, can you multiply this number by 10? Their response is, you just stick a 0 on the end of it. When that only works for a very small amount of questions. And it doesn't work for every question. So then when they get to a question where it doesn't work, because they think it does work just by sticking a 0 on the end to multiply it by 10, they get the wrong answer. And they don't really know why, because they've sort of discovered a pattern that works for some cases and think it applies to everything. So what I'm going to show you in this video is a method that will work for every single case. It doesn't matter what number you get or whether you're multiplying by 10, 100 or 1000 or dividing. In fact, this method will always work, and I highly encourage your child, if they are sort of in that mindset of, oh, you just stick a 0 on the end, to try and change their mindset out of that so that they can get these more tricky questions correct. Because if they've got the right method, it'll work for every single question. So what is this right method then? Well, let's start off with an example where we are multiplying by 10. Now, in this example here, this is quite a standard, very sort of basic example, but I just want to show you the method, right? The idea behind it. So if you imagine I've got the number 23. Now, thanks to the number system that we use, the decimal system, multiplying by 10, 100, and 1000 is actually a lot easier than multiplying by anything else because of the system that we use. So to multiply by 10, the whole number shifts one space to the left. Basically, what's happening is we've got the ones column here and we've got the tens column here. These two tens are becoming two hundreds because it moves one space to the left. So I'm going to write it beneath. So this ends up in the hundreds column. And this 3 ends up in the tens column. So you get this. Now, we can't just leave the number like that where you've got 2 hundreds and 3 tens because there's nothing there. You can't just write a number like that because people might think it's still the number 23. So we would fill in this gap here, this gap that's been created by moving the 3 out of the ones column, with a 0. So the answer to what is 23 times 10, well, it would be 230. And this is where that sort of misconception that I talked about earlier arises from, because students see a question like that, they see that there's a 0 at the end, so there's a 0 here, and then there's a 0 at the end of the answer, or you just add a 0 on. But we're going to look at some questions where that doesn't work. But this method of moving the place values one space to the left because they're becoming 10 times bigger, that does work. How would you do this question then if it was 23 times 100? Well, actually, 100 is the same as 10 times 10. So what you are actually doing by multiplying by 100 is multiplying by 10 twice. So if you have the number 23, you are going to be multiplying by 10 twice. You now move each place value 2 spaces to the left, right? 2 rather than 1 because we're multiplying by 10 twice. So it goes once, twice. So this is the ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. So this 2 ends up in the thousands column, and this 3 ends up in the hundreds. And then we have to fill in these 2 gaps that have been created because we've moved these 2 numbers out with zeros because there's nothing there, but we need them to hold the value of the number, because if we just wrote 23, people will think we're talking about 23, and we're not. We're talking about 2,300, so we have to fill in and hold the place value with those zeros. So the answer to what is 23 times 100, it is 2,300. And then it doesn't take a genius to work out that if we wanted to multiply by 1,000, well, 1,000 is the same as 10 times 10 times 10, so we are just going to move the values 3 spaces to the left in terms of the place values. So 23, 1, 2, 3 spaces to the left, that goes there. 1, 2, 3 spaces to the left, that goes there. Again, this is a lot easier with squared paper, by the way. So if you have squared paper, I would highly encourage you to use that. And then we would hold the value of the number with the zeros. So the answer is 23,000. So the key idea here is if you multiply by 10, then the whole number moves 1 space to the left because each value becomes 10 times bigger. The number becomes 10 times bigger, so all the values move 1 space to the left in the place value system. If you multiply by 100, it's 2 spaces, and if you multiply by 1,000, it's 3 spaces. But again, you might question, okay, well, why can't we just add zeros on the end? Why does that not work? Well, let's say I had a look at this question here. Calculate 0.5 times 100. Again, a question that students will be able, or should be able to answer without a calculator. Now, if you use the logic of just adding zeros on the end, then you might think, okay, I'm just going to add 2 zeros onto the end of that, so the answer is this. But 0.5 and 0.500 are the same number. So you haven't multiplied by 100 because that is the same as that. They are exactly the same number. So this whole adding the zeros on the end doesn't work when we've got decimals. And in actual fact, a lot of questions, especially at GCSE level, use decimals. So we need to use the method that I've shown in this video to be able to answer this type of question. Well, first of all, let me set out my number. And I know that each value is going to move 2 spaces to the left. The reason why it's 2 is because 100 times by 100, which is 10 times 10. So it's going to be 2 spaces to the left. So I'm going to move this value once, twice. Again, would be easier with squared paper. And this value is going to go once, twice. Sorry, not once, twice. Not on the decimal point. Once, twice. Again, so much easier with squared paper. And there's your decimal point. Now this here has now got a gap. And this here is now got a gap. So let's fill them in with zeros. So our final answer is 0, well, our answer from this is 050.0. However, you wouldn't really write a number like that. You wouldn't have a leading 0 in front of the number. Like, you wouldn't write 120 as 0120. That doesn't really make much sense. So we don't really need this 0. And also, we don't really need the 0 after the decimal point, because 50 and 50.0 are the same value. This 0.0 isn't holding any value, right? So we don't need this 0. But we do need this one. We definitely need this one, because without that one, it would be the number 5. But we don't have the number 5. We have the number 50. So this is kind of a very key idea about multiplying by 10, 100, 1,000 is like what zeros are relevant and hold value. Will hold the value of the number, and what zeros are not relevant. So any zeros that are in front of the number itself, we don't really need those, so we can get rid of those. And if it's 0.0 after the decimal point, as long as there's no other values other than 0 after the decimal point, then those can be got rid of as well. Like we couldn't get rid of something like this. You can't get rid of this 0, because if you did, this number would change into 10.1, and they're not the same number. So this 0 does hold value, because it's holding the space for that 1, and without it, it would change the number. Whereas this 0 isn't holding any value, because there are no non-zero digits after this 0, if you get what I'm kind of getting at. So that is the key idea here. It's all about moving values to the left. Now, some students will say, oh, I can just move the decimal point to the right. It's the same as moving the numbers to the left. I would never ever recommend this. The reason for this is because the decimal point is not something that moves in a number. The decimal point is to represent the position of of the decimal part. That never moves in a number. And when you get to a higher level of mathematics, you realise that it's vitally important that that decimal point stays as it is. So to move the decimal point seems a little bit bad habits, I would say, is the best way of describing it. I mean, mathematically you get the same answer, but it's not necessarily the right logic of getting to the right answer, if that makes any sense. So I would always recommend moving values to the left rather than moving the decimal point to the right. Now, if we were looking at a division, well, division actually works exactly the same as multiplication of 10, 100 and 1000, but just the other way. So remember, multiplication, you move the value to the left. So with a division, you're going to move the values to the right. In this case, I've got 0.4. So I'm going to move the values one space to the right. So this 4 goes one space to the right, so it goes here. And this 0 goes one space to the right, so it goes here. I'll put my point there. So my answer is this 0.04. Now, technically this is the right answer, but we would usually write a 0 in front of the decimal point to represent it 0.04. Right? It doesn't necessarily hold any value because 0.04 is the correct answer, but it's traditional that we would write a 0 in front of this, so it's 0.04. Finally then, if we got to an even more complicated one with decimals, this here, 68 divided by 1000, well, if we're dividing by 1000, we're going to move 3 spaces, and because we're dividing to the right, because the number is getting smaller, it's going sort of down because it's getting smaller. So we have 68, 3 spaces, I'll put my decimal point here just so I don't forget it, 3 spaces to the right, so that 8 goes here. 1, 2, 3, and that 6 goes here. Remember, we don't count the decimal point as a place value. When we say move 3 spaces to the right, the decimal point doesn't count. The decimal point shows where the decimal is. It isn't part of the place value system as such. It just shows where the decimal values start. And so the decimal point would go there. And so we would have this, something point, something 68. And obviously we would fill in these values here with zeros, because otherwise our value, it wouldn't make much sense without those zeros, because you would just have 0.68 and they're not the same number. So we need to fill in those gaps with zeros that hold the place value. Okay then, that about wraps it up for this video. It has been slightly longer than the usual videos, and I think that's because sometimes the idea of multiplying by 10, 100,000, although sometimes we can take it for granted, I think can be quite complicated in some ways, especially with some of the questions that students might encounter. If you do have any questions about anything that I've explained in this video, please, please, please let me know, and I will try and get round to answering those in the comments. But all I want to say is thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.